Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
So today's episode is going to be pretty interesting. And I want to say right off the bat that I'm not doing this show for titillation or to, intrigue you with the mysteries and maybe, air quotes here, weirdness of what goes on with sex. I mean, this is meant to be a respectful and supportive episode about fetishes, or what is called paraphilia, which the technical definition is sort of loving what is other. And I think a lot of us have curiosity about sex, and we wonder if we're normal or what people are doing. And there's sort of this, titillation or this curiosity or this, wanting to peek behind the curtain at what goes on with sex. And I know that that's interesting, but I also don't want this just to be showmanship or trying to hook you in with this. I really want to describe what's going on with people who have this phenomenon, this paraphilia of one sort or another, a fetish. This is real stuff going on with people, and they may be perfectly happy with it, but a lot of people struggle. They feel ashamed, they feel humiliated, they feel confused, they feel broken. I mean, this is not talked about enough, and it's not understood enough, so people can suffer when this is what they find erotic, right? When they have a fetish. So I wanted to do the show to talk matter-of-factly about fetishes, what they are, what we know about where they come from, which is not a lot, how we assess for them, how people can accommodate that in their sex life with their partner, if they're partnered, or how they can find a partner, how we can normalize this, basically, understand what's going on, make sure that things are, first of all, consensual, but that we're lessening the distress around it and supporting people that have fetishes. So for any of you listeners who don't, I understand that you're going to be curious and this is going to be interesting, but I want you to keep in mind that there are real people living with this, every day, all around you, who might be struggling, right? So this is meant to be an informative and supportive episode for people. And I have on today the perfect guest to talk about this, I think, Jennifer Valli. You may remember her. She was on episode 17 talking about men's sexual health concerns. We had a great conversation. This is one of her specialties in her practice. So she works with people with fetishes a lot. And so I wanted her to come on and talk about what they are. What do we know about where they come from? How does she assess? How does she work with it? What needs to be thought about and considered? And then how does she work with people in treatment? So that's my episode today. I hope you find it interesting and informative, and that it opens your eyes to what goes on in the world. So Jennifer, thank you so much for coming back on the show with me today.
Oh, I'm so glad you have me back. I really appreciate it. And also for you to be addressing this topic. It's a subject that's not so understood.
That is true. And certainly, I think not even by sex therapists, right? Much less the general listening audience, right? So let's start right off with, what is paraphilia, and maybe give some examples so people have, some understanding of what we're talking about.
Sure. So a paraphilia is when somebody has an intense sexual arousal pattern to an atypical object or situation. So really, we are talking about fetishes. Paraphilias are erotic interests that not everyone would consider particularly erotic. And most people in the field in sexual health believe that paraphilias are similar to orientations in that you can't change these ingrained interests. So if we do, let's just talk about two examples. So right up front, so people can kind of get something in their mind. We're going to start with the cuckold fetish. And a cuckold fetish it shows up in lots of different ways, but it can be hearing about or watching your partner have sex with another person. And if we just look at the classic example, it would be a man that wants to see his partner or wife be pleasured by another man. So there would be 3 people in the interaction, and the husband would be called the cuck, and the other man who would be having sex with his wife would be called the bull. And the bull, in general, is more dominant within the situation compared to the husband or even the wife, at least in the bedroom. And so many times, we end up with the outside man having a larger penis, and this is because there's often a humiliation component. And humiliation is one that cuts across lots of different fantasies because some people feel like it brings more vulnerability and emotional closeness.
I just want to point, that's really hitting me in the moment because I've been talking to clients lately about humiliation, and they're humiliated. That humiliation is part of their, they feel ashamed that that's part of their fantasy. And that's the first time I've heard that correlation to vulnerability, that maybe that's the way they get close to vulnerability. Or if it's about humiliating their partner, maybe it's about putting their partner into vulnerability. Like that's just sort of blowing my mind right now at this moment. Okay. That's really a helpful concept.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, that is, I see that through lots of different fetishes, but it's certainly present with this one.
Yeah.
And with this cuckold fetish, the husband, I'm going to clarify, is different. It's different than a threesome because the husband could be, and again, the husband, man, is usually more often with men. It can be straight men, gay men, less cuck queens out there, fewer females have this fetish.
Okay.
But the man could be present watching his wife sleep with somebody. Other times he could listen on the phone while she's with somebody and hearing the whole thing. Or he could just hear about the details after from her. And usually if the husband is present, again, the bull and the wife, maybe even telling the husband, you can be here, but you got to stay in the corner. You're not allowed to participate. You have to stay over there. And so another aspect that's not so politically correct here is that if you look this up online, this fetish up online, you're going to be more likely to see this bull. The outside man is African American. And sadly, the idea, I think, is that element makes it more humiliating for certain people. But I have to say, while that's pretty standard in online, that race component is not nearly as common as what I see when we are in practice.
Okay, when you're saying online, you're talking about like in pornography. This is what's going to be represented.
If you look up, if you just Google cuckold fetish, you're going to find the bull is going to be African American man. But what I'm saying is in practice, when I see a bunch of people with this fetish and that race comes up once in a while, but not typically.
Yeah. And it hasn't shown up. I mean, I haven't had a lot of this in my practice, but I have had some cuckold fetish come in, and I don't know that race has ever been a component, actually.
Okay. Yeah. So that's interesting, right?
I suppose it plays into this myth we have too, right? Cultural myth that somehow an African American man is going to be well endowed, because you said typically this is going to involve somebody with a larger penis, more dominant stance. Okay. And to clarify, you said this is different than a threesome. So what makes it
different? There's a humiliation component here where the man really wants to have somebody that's, how do I say, basically somebody that's it's not just pleasuring his partner. Like, I think of threesomes more like, okay, people are maybe all interacting together. It's a little bit more, maybe they may agree on certain things going into it, but the specific dynamic is that the bull is going to be more dominant. They are going to have a larger penis. They're going to be, basically able to, that whole idea of having somebody that is better than they are, or even not even that, or even an African American man that would be not quite as good as they are. Somebody else so she wants somebody else to pleasure her, not him.
Right. So this person can do it and I can't. There's sort of a one up and one down element. So this is different than a threesome where somebody might take delight in their partner being pleasured by someone else. This has got a sort of status component to it.
It's a delight, but it's kind of the other flip side of jealousy, right?
Yeah.
It's all
right.
It's all wrapped in together.
Okay. All right. So that's one example.
And then one example. Another example is infantilism. And infantilism is wanting to be treated like an infant. So during sexual time, the person might wear a diaper, use pacifiers, be in a playpen. They might drink from bottles or nurse or even use the diaper. And we're going to keep coming back to this one as we talk through things today. But in terms of understanding the word paraphilia, the definition, we break it down, literally translated, para is Greek for other or outside of, and then philia translates to loving. So, important to understand as we talk through these fetishes, when fetishes are problematic, we call them paraphilic disorders, and other times they're not, and we call them paraphilic interests.
So the exact same desire, right? The exact same erotic desire can be a problem or not.
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct. And we're going to talk through that today when we talk about kind of how we assess them and also what the DSM has to say about them.
Okay.
For DSM basically has us, for it to be a disorder in the DSM, which is our diagnostic and statistical manual, we call the DSM. It's how we categorize things in mental health. The person needs to have either acted on their interest with a non-consenting person, or maybe not acted on it, but having this interest has caused them distress. And if we look at the DSM, typically it's about 6 months. So it's a pattern of distress. It's not just
not just one weekend.
Something gets in their mind.
Right.
That's right.
Okay. So a pattern of distress for them or non-consensual behavior, which is always problematic.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And the truth is, this is a shift in our DSM to be a little more sex positive, because before, anything other than vaginal intercourse was seen as abnormal and labeled as a disorder. So, right now the DSM is saying that, if there's distress, then it qualifies for a disorder. But I have to say, there's some people that feel like these shouldn't even be in the DSM at all, because it's all pretty, subjective about what is unusual or not. Right.
Well, and I suppose you think about the distress is what defines a lot of things, right? Rapid ejaculation, it's a problem. It's causing distress, right? There's not a certain amount of minutes somebody should last. And somebody could have distress about their sexual orientation or their body shape. I mean, we could have distress about so many things, and it's the distress that's the problem. It's not the thing.
Well, some of the time, actually, with PE, premature ejaculation, it's got to have the distress, but it's also less than a minute. So they combine kind of some more objective criteria, but then that distress, that's right, before the person wishes it to happen.
Right. But there are couples that have sex that lasts less than a minute and they're perfectly happy, right? So it's not, the distress is such a strong component of when is something a problem. So it's not about, in this case, it's not about their desire that it's a problem. It's their distress that's the problem.
Yes. Yeah. Their distress or if it's non-consenting. Those are the kind of what the DSM has shifted to now. But yeah. And if we look at the DSM, they have 8 paraphilic disorders, and then they have 2 more catch-all categories. So it might make sense for us to kind of start with these 8 base disorders, and then we can also talk about what falls into these catch-all catch-all categories. Okay, so if I'm just going to run through some of these that are in that they've got 8. So the voyeuristic disorder is when a person has recurrent and intense sexual arousal from watching somebody have sex or somebody without clothes, but the other person doesn't know they're being watched. So there's the
that's non-consensual part. That is always a problem. Yeah.
Right. And then exhibitionistic disorder, this is sexual arousal coming from exposing genitals to an unsuspecting person. Mm-hmm. Frauderistic disorder, this is rubbing up against a non-consenting person. Mm-hmm. Sexual masochism, disorder. And again, this is disorder, so it can be that it's not disorder if it's not distress. But sexual masochism is the arousal from being humiliated, beaten, bound, or made to suffer in some way. Sexual sadism is listed as a disorder. The arousal is from inflicting pain. This can be physical or psychological, but the arousal is coming from the suffering of somebody else. Pedophilia, pedophilic disorder. The interest is a prepubescent child. So this is somewhere around 13 or younger. And then the disorder has to be somebody that is 16 years old. And then the kid that they are fantasizing about or they're with is at least 5 years younger than the child.
Which sort of takes out of the mix kids that are closer in age that are experimenting, exploring, that it's...
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. Fetishistic disorder can be from non-living objects or non-genital body parts. So objectophilia is an example of that. Maybe you have a man who is into cars, breaks into cars to masturbate in the car. That's one. Transvestic disorder is arousal from cross-dressing. Now, this is different than being transgender. Transgender person is not turned on. In fact, there's a really high rate of suicide attempts because their body doesn't match how they think of themselves. But for a paraphilic transvestic disorder, there is a pattern of intense arousal when the person cross-dresses.
And again, what makes this a disorder is their own distress around this, right?
Right.
Like cross-dressing.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes. And then we have these two catch-all categories. So if your listeners haven't heard their fetish yet, Jessica, they don't need to panic.
Right,
okay.
Right. There's room for everyone.
That's right. We've got other specified paraphilic disorder and unspecified paraphilic disorder. And we've got these last two categories because really anything can be fetishized. Anything can be turned into become basically a paraphilic obsession.
Right.
The difference between the two catch-all categories, really has to do with whether the clinician decides to name the paraphilic interest or not. So, other specified paraphilic disorder, the clinician's going to name the interest. So, if we say a person's into enemas, for example, they have distress about it, the therapist could diagnose them with, they would say, other specific paraphilic disorder, and then they'd specify clismophilia. Okay, but more often, I have to say, if you have a therapist who's been trained, like AASECT-certified, extensively trained in sexual health, they would be more likely to diagnose the person with unspecified paraphilic disorder, and they would not name the interest.
Right.
Or they might not even write it down at all, right? Because who knows where this is going to go.
Right. Okay. So in both your cases of the cuckold or the infantilism, those would be other specified paraphilic disorders if somebody was going to write them down.
Right.
I mean, if they were choosing to delineate it. Right. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, actually, and not rather than other, they probably would use the unspecified and they wouldn't write it down.
Right.
More likely.
If they weren't going to use,
Yeah, because we know how much shame people come in with and now there are some spaces where I probably would write it down. I think of a guy that I work with who has a lot of delusional and anxiety, a lot of spaces around that are kind of making the fetish worse. I think sometimes anxiety and different overlapping comorbid things can happen that make it make it a little bit worse. And if I would put that down, it helps maybe the psychiatrist unspecified. I don't need to tell him what the fetish is, but it helps him know when he's treating this particular psychiatrist is male, when he treats this guy's the overall picture is that this guy can get his obsessions kind of wrapped up around his fetish, So in that case, I might write it, but I would write unspecified paraphilic disorder and not say what it is.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here thinking, it's good that the DSM is gradually moving in this direction of sex positivity, right? But I'm not even sure. Well, I can't imagine that all therapists or medical providers or professionals that people might come into contact are going to have this open mind. Like people pathologized about their interests all the time, and they go in and who's going to treat them like this is just a paraphilic interest. What's, no problem if it's not causing you distress or your partner.
Yes. And it's a huge problem with general therapists who've not had like this. I know I keep beating in the AASECT training, but it's without that training, people think, oh, sex is interesting, I could talk about this. And then because it's not a protected word, term, sex therapy, except for Florida, then they talk about it, and then they are not getting accurate information, which is why your podcasts are wonderful, because they're getting people information that wouldn't otherwise have it.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
So. And it's sort of heartbreaking to think, the people that I've had in my practice who have come in. I mean, I've had plenty of people in my practice with a fetish who have no problem about it, right? They're comfortable,
right?
They have an interest. But the people that feel such shame about it, and one of the biggest roles that I've had, and I'm sure you've got this too, is to normalize this for people, to accept that there's nothing wrong with what you find erotic. I mean, yes, it needs to be consensual and, how you act these things out. But in other hands, these people would just have that shame reinforced.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so we're going to actually come back to that, because there are some spaces where it's a problem, right?
Yeah, right.
And we're going to talk about that when we get into assessment. But,
okay.
And I think what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is to send you a list of a batch of these so that you can post them of all different names like urophilia, clismophilia, we can have those on your site just for our timing's sake so that people can see the words. But is that okay with you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm happy to put on any links. Yeah.
Okay. Because I think you had asked me to think about like what causes paraphilias. And
I'm sure that's
touch on that.
That's a common question, right? Like what makes me
very common
by this, right? Where do these come from?
Yes, it's something, I think it's probably our most common question, because they think, what in the world happened here? How did I get stuck on this? And I think a lot of therapists want to trace it back to something that happened a long time ago, maybe an incident that explains why this particular interest why it became erotic. I think of a man who has cock and ball torture paraphilia.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was young, like around 10, his cousin accidentally hurt him genitally, and his aunt wanted to make sure he was okay. So she checks his penis and testicles, which was kind of erotic at this young age.
Yeah.
So we have this genital pain kind of being wrapped around these erotic feelings. And so sometimes you can trace it back to an incident earlier on, but other times people just like what they like.
Yeah.
And really, tracing it back, I think, is really important to our patients because they've been so focused on this. But it's less important to me in terms of treatment. Now, I talk it through with them, meeting them where they are, but the person has, basically because the person spends so much time in their head obsessing, why this particular thing. But in terms of cause, one of the things we don't totally know. We do not know really what causes this. But one of the things that kind of, I think, lends a little insight is that males outnumber females for many, many paraphilias. So I've heard the numbers as high as 99-1. I personally don't believe that there's that big of a difference. And we know that some of it depends on the particular fetish, but we know that the incidence is overall higher, way higher in men.
Yeah.
And so one of the theories is if we have like a young man around maybe even 10, sees something taboo or forbidden, but it's also erotic, he has this immediate biological marker for his interest, and that's his erection. And then as he masturbates, this reinforces this arousal pattern, and it gets mapped in as kind of part of what's erotic for him, his erotic template. And so women don't have this obvious erection that serves as a marker for their arousal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And along those lines, we know also in general that men can get locked into specific interests easier. Like their interests tend to be more rigid, and men are just not quite as flexible around this as compared to women. And we even know this with animals. Like if we look at animals, scientists switched newborn sheep at birth. They switched sheep and goats at birth.
Okay.
And they had baby goats. Baby goats are raised by adult sheep, and then vice versa. And they reunite all these animals back together when they're adults. And what you find is that what they found is that the females, whether they're goats or sheep, all the females would mate with both goats and sheep. Okay.
Okay.
But the males whether they're goats or sheep, had zero interest in their own biological species. They basically only wanted to go with the animal that they were conditioned with, at the one that they were conditioned to grow up with. So even in animals, we see like females tend to have more flexibility, fluidity is the word we use.
Right.
And males are likely to have this sexual imprinting, this rigid arousal pattern that can make it easier for them to lock in on specific things or more vulnerable to get locked in, depending on how you look at it, right?
Right. That's interesting. I've not heard of that study before. So, and I'm with you too about not, it's not the drilling down on what might have happened to cause this has sort of this assumption that something went wrong, right? Like it really reinforces the idea of when did I break, which is not a helpful way to be thinking about this, really. Like it's one thing to have some curiosity, I guess, if you can hold it a little bit more lightly and think, where might this have, laid down in my brain? But this idea of we have to look for the root cause of the disease or something is, that's not what I want to reinforce with clients.
I think it's perfect you're pointing that out. That's perfect. Yes.
Hi, it's Jessa. We're just going to take a quick pause here, or a little breather in the middle of the show. Thanks for listening so far. I'm wondering if you have a question that you want me to answer on a future episode. You can actually record a question for me at our website, bettersexpodcast.com. You're going to find the recorder on the footer of every page and on the side of the episode posts. And if I choose your question, I'll play it on the air and answer it as part of the show. I'd love to hear from you.
So you want to look at kind of how we assess when we are like looking at them?
You do work with this a lot in your practice, right? I mean, that's why you're on the show.
Yeah, so. I do.
Because I get
everybody
once in a while, but not that much. So,
right. Well, the first thing we look at is whether the person's fetish is egosyntonic or dystonic. And all that means is basically we're just talking about their attitude about the fetish. If it's ego-dystonic, they're going to have shame and guilt and distress about it. And if it's egosyntonic, they wouldn't be so upset about it. But the thing is, both of these actually could be problematic. And that's where it does depend on what the fetish is.
Okay.
So let's say we have a guy who smells ladies' panties, for example. Okay. If he has a lot of shame around this, he might be actually more likely to come in to get some help.
Right.
And then like you mentioned, we're going to help him have not so much distress about this and normalize. But let's say we got a guy that has a frauderistic fetish. That's like the rubbing up against somebody in a train.
Yes.
Right. And this one is not legal. So if the guy has zero distress, and he's not really concerned if he engages or not, then we could maybe have a problem.
Yes.
So it does, we're going to come back to that actually in it again. So the first thing is whether they have distress about it or not. And then the second thing we look at, so there's a total of 5 things we look at.
Okay.
Second thing we look at is how high the person's drive is, like how high is their libido. And we're not just looking at how often they masturbate, because we're also looking really at how sexually preoccupied and obsessed they think they are. Have their partners experienced them as sexually preoccupied and obsessed about sex in general? Has the person's drive impacted their relationships or caused fights? Has the person been involved in risk-taking behaviors around masturbation?
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, we all have a subjective bias about how much is too much masturbating, right? People tend to assume everybody that has more sex than I do or masturbates more than I do is too much.
That's the line, right?
That's the line, right? The third thing we look at is if their interests are exclusive or non-exclusive. And this means, is it their only interest or do they have other interests?
Okay.
So my experience is that people come in and they are thinking they have one fetish. And as you talk through with them to help them really understand their erotic template, basically understand what things are more sexy, less sexy, the nuances of their interests, you see that there are several overlapping interests. So if we come back to the infantilism that you and I talked about at the beginning, that's the one with the diaper. Let's say a person also soils the diaper. So they might have a coprophilic fetish now because that's feces related.
Okay.
Right. And you see a lot of these these two actually go together a lot of the time because that diaper intensifies the humiliation. And so when we look at that situation, we actually have a bunch of pieces there. We've got a dominant submissive situation with one person being an infant. We have humiliation taken to a higher level if they soil the diaper. There's kind of a mother or a female figure who has a lot of power and the
Right.
ability to produce shame or humiliation, or to accept and nurture the person. So for this infant-related fetish, we have love, nurturing, humiliation. It's all wrapped up in this fetish.
Yeah.
So the guy comes in, think he's got this one thing going on, his one go-to, but we want to separate it out, and that becomes important when we talk about accommodating in this situation later, when we talk about that.
Okay.
And I think a lot of interests cluster. And so when they do, we want to understand what's the strongest interest and which one carries the most shame.
Okay. And could you do that same I'm sorry, that same thing with the cuckold fetish? Are there clusters with that one too that come to mind?
Yeah, that's going to come. So we've got like, there's definitely dominance and submission. There's humiliation. Those
Maybe
two come to
voyeurism?
my mind. There could be. Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm thinking of a lot of different things that go into that. Because that one varies in terms of how it plays out so much. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, can vary a lot. So if we go to number 4, the thing we also look at when we're assessing any fetish. So these are for any fetishes, right?
Okay.
But anything. So if you've got a listener that's got one we haven't talked about, anything. The 4th thing we look at is the interest obligatory or non-obligatory? And this means, is it required for arousal? Can the person get aroused with this one particular fantasy, or can he get aroused in other ways? Because if he can get aroused in other ways, it's non-obligatory.
Okay.
And then the final thing we look at is whether it's legal or not legal, right? Because this is going to determine later kind of how we work with it. If we're going to normalize feelings around the fetish, or if we're going to grieve the fact, help them grieve with grief and loss, at least parts of their fetish. And if we look at 3 examples here, just to make sure we get it, if the person has a lactation fetish, right? This is totally legal. And as therapists, we're going to help them normalize and maybe even, work their partner into this. But let's say we talk about one that involves vomiting. So vomiting is legal. Vomiting on somebody's legal, but the person may not be able to find a partner willing to engage. So we still come back to the grief and loss,
right?
Even though it's legal. Now, if we look at one that's not legal, say we have a pedophilic interest, and so the guy's interested in kids, and he's got a high drive. So this is not legal. There's going to be grief and loss work, and because we're looking at him not following through.
Right.
And now you see why it's key to understand if the person has distress about this, because if the guy is upset about this attraction, he may be coming in to talk to you. He's willing to look at what his triggers are. There's actually tons of questions here. The guy might benefit from Lexapro or Zoloft to kind of quiet his drive, any SSRI. But if we've got a guy that is not bothered at all by this, his interest, and this is his interest, then we've got a problem. And he could go on anti-androgens, Depo-Provera. I would say pedophilia is a whole other show for you, Jessa.
Yeah. But there is this concept of, non-offending pedophiles.
Yes.
Right. And so these are people with distress who are determined not to act on this interest.
That's correct.
Right. And then you've got
that's right.
At least a potentially offending pedophile, or if they haven't already, which is really a whole different can of worms, right? Like this is And I don't know if you treat people in your practice that are offenders, or if that crosses a line into another kind of
I don't. And
treatment.
I would say I would say you could find a better person than I am that specializes in pedophilia to be able to speak on that.
Right.
But in general, if we just look across paraphilias, the more the interest is exclusive and obligatory, the higher the drive and the less stress producing, the harder it is to shift. And again, it's not possible to change somebody's interests, but there are some things that we can do that we're going to talk about to alleviate stress when we're trying to get needs met.
Okay.
So does that in terms of our assessment?
Yes.
Exclusive is harder, obligatory is harder, higher drive is harder, less stress. Okay. So you want to talk about maybe accommodating.
Yeah.
Kind of how to,
right. What do you, besides the normalizing, assuming it should be
right.
normalized, and making somebody comfortable with their eroticism, how do you help them accommodate, and how do they work with a partner? Because again, in my practice, I'm seeing mostly couples. So where one person has this thing they want, and the other one is not interested in it, or, maybe if it's in a turnoff, or, how do you work with people?
Yeah. Okay. So I thought maybe we could work a little backwards and start by maybe like at least 3 mistakes that I see people make in trying to accommodate it, and then maybe what to do instead, kind of. So sometimes I think that finding the perfect fetish partner can be a setup. So if we say, let's just say another speak through example, I think is easier for people to get. So if we've got a man who wants feces all over a lady's breasts, finding a lady that wants this exact thing is going to be a setup. But this is where it really depends on what the fetish, what the interest is, right? So there is FetLife. I know you know about FetLife, but for your listeners, this is kind of a Facebook available for people with fetishes, and people can meet somebody locally. If their interest is some variation of dominance and submission, for example, they very well may be able to find a good match.
Right.
But we're going to come back to that one. But another mistake, just to stay on track here, another mistake I see is that people make it all about the person with the fetish. This is a common mistake. All the sexual interactions are focused on getting this one fetish met.
Right.
And the other person gets completely lost, and the person with the fetish is accused of being selfish, and nobody wins. Yeah. And instead we want to make sure that as much time and energy goes into both partners' interests. Another mistake I see is trying to meet both people's needs in one night. So it might be better to say, actually, tonight's going to be more about you, and the next time it'll be more about me. And so if we go back to, actually, let's just use water sports. This is urinating on some person then urinates on another person. And then we've got a partner that's all into like flowers and candles. Okay. Trying to do both of these on the same night is going to be that's going to be like not a good plan.
Right.
With neither of them feeling great about the night. So important actually to note is that I think people can go where they need to in their own mind, even if it's not their night, right? Especially when we talk about like the sexual dysfunctions that we had talked about earlier in a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
When it's the flower and candle night, a guy with the fetish may need to go to his peak erotic interest in his mind to get the erection on the candle and flower night.
Right. Right.
So other accommodations, one of the things that you can do is strengthen certain interests. And I say that really carefully because you can't change ingrained interests. They're pretty mapped in. Paraphilias are mapped in if the person at a younger age. But if the person has distress or negotiating it, we may be able to soften the extent that a person has conditioned themselves in one rigid direction. Yeah. So if we go back to the guy into being an infant, we may be able to strengthen certain aspects he's into. So let's say we have a partner who's like saying, no, there's going to be no diapers, no feces anywhere around. Right. But she could be open to humiliating him or dominating him in some other way. Maybe they have a clean cloth diaper nearby and they verbally go through some scenarios that could be a turn on for him. So we're not really trying to change his interests, but as therapists, you and I are we could help them strengthen facets to their the facets that are already erotic to him, and helping him really look at parts of it that a partner might be open to.
Yeah. How can you get enough, right? If not everything.
How can you get a piece, right? Yeah. How can you get a piece of what you're into? Yeah. Another thing I might do is to ask someone to make a hierarchy of their interests, and then we look at compromising. So, in other words, I think of a couple. They say they were not sexually compatible because he was very focused on rimming, and rimming is having somebody orally stimulate him anally. And then she, on the other hand, wasn't open to anything non-traditional. So much that she didn't use curse words. So what we did is we put their interests on a hierarchy with peak interest at the top, and pretty easily he could do that. He thought of things that were most sexy to him. Rimming, we have pegging. That's whether she could put on a strap-on and penetrate him. So pegging and rimming we have at the top of our hierarchy. So like that would be like values of like 100 or 95. So really erotic. And then where he needed help was kind of looking at the middle or lower level ways of engaging in his particular interest with this hierarchy. So for example, her holding an anal stimulator on him, he rated that about a 50, like on the hierarchy, or him holding an anal stimulator on himself, but doing it in her presence.
Yeah.
This was at 40, so not as good as her doing it, but it's still erotic.
Right.
And then maybe watching some videos on anal things was lower down, but less erotic. And then her talking through some anal scenarios was lower, maybe in the 30 on his hierarchy. And then the least erotic thing, but still listed there as still erotic, would be him talking through anal scenarios with her. So he's, they're basically, I'll tell you what happened. When they engaged in just the verbal things, that's the least erotic things at the very bottom of the hierarchy, he came in and he's like, this is the best sex has ever been. I'm like, okay. So it was like being honest about his interest, being known authentically with the vulnerability was the biggest turn on. And he didn't necessarily have to do all the things on his list to get that feeling.
How did you get her, or you get her? But anyway, how did she end up open to even having conversations about that? When you say she wouldn't even use curse words, like some people are, equally rigid on the no side.
On the no side, right. Well, I think this hierarchy actually helped her understand. They came in and said, we're going to maybe divorce. This is where we are with it because we're not sexually compatible. And, they had tried to go to this over and over again. And, she's just like, no. But the hierarchy, I think it allows for a compromise because it's not quite, she's hearing these things as like rimming and pegging, like no-goes. And he hasn't even thought about lower levels to these. Yeah. And so, definitely it takes trust on the end of the couple, trust with the therapist, but trust with each other to be able to say, okay, in what parameters can we do this? And we know this, even that our patients in BDSM or, bondage and submission they are like the best communicators ever. Right? They are really good at negotiating what they can do and what they can't do. And so I think for this particular lady, hearing, having a therapist to help negotiate and also think outside the box a little bit to say, not so black and white. We don't necessarily have to have this as our rigid no-go, right? Yeah, this could be what other ways can it look at? That's why we break it down and do that assessment. That assessment is so key at the beginning to break it down into all these facets because they could get some of these things met or pieces met. Right. Another thing I might do is I have patients imagine 10 pictures that are really sexy to them. And so the question is, what would we take out of the picture that would make this picture no longer sexy? And what would we take out of the picture that wouldn't make any difference at all? So what are the nuances to their interest? I might even ask somebody to bring in their favorite pictures and then ask them to describe what they see. What do they think is happening in the picture? What's going on that's particularly interesting or intriguing? And then what happens before this picture? What happens after the picture? Do they imagine themselves in the picture? Or is this a person they wish they were? Or are they an observer in the room? And then what are the feelings associated with what they see? Is there humiliation? Maybe there's gravitas, And so the pictures make it easy. They make it much easier for you but any therapist. Right. You know what you're doing. I'm talking to general therapists that really should be getting the training. But basically it makes it easier for both the patient and the therapist to get underneath the interest in a way that words make it, that words are harder when they come in with the shame and trying to, be able to explain. It's like, okay, what do you see in this picture? They really have to trust us to do this because they come in with so much shame. And honestly, if the therapist doesn't have compassion for the tortured soul sitting across from them, they really should not be doing this work. But But if your listeners can get to a certified AASECT therapist, it puts them in a better position to do this with their partner, because they may be partnered with people that don't even know they have a fetish. And this sets them up to share, because if they can share with you, then they may be able to share with their partner.
Right. And I'm thinking another thing you offer, as a therapist in that room, is total acceptance of this thing. Like they share this picture and you're just like, okay, and if the partner sees that too, and gets the message, there's nothing broken with your spouse or your partner. Nothing's wrong here. We have to talk about what's the reality and how you guys are going to accommodate this together. That maybe that's part of where their flexibility comes from.
Yes, I think it's because it's like a lot of our issues that they come in as one identified patient, but the truth is it's a couples issue.
Right.
It becomes a couples issue. And if we can approach it that way, I think you're exactly right.
Right.
Now, one thing that might be helpful to talk about is if we've got somebody partnered, how to go about that. And if we have somebody that's not partnered.
Yeah. Okay.
That we could, Okay. So if somebody's in a relationship, really just telling their partner is really the first step. And so letting your partner know, honestly, can be very erotic for the person in and of itself, because you're first really just letting them know that you want to be known in a genuine and authentic way. And you don't have to hash out all these details here that we're talking about yet, right? About if the partner's open to it. You could even say, we don't even have to talk about if you're open to this right now. I just want to let you know about this, right? Just letting them know. And if let me just say what not to do. And actually, let's come back to the cuckold fetish.
Okay.
You don't want to just bring home a guy to have sex with your wife. Okay. That's not going to be a good plan.
Yeah.
Okay. Bringing it on her is going to be a bad plan. And chances are, if you have this fetish or any fetish, you know this fetish inside and out. In your mind, you've been over it and been all over it. So we've got to keep in mind that they're just brand new to it. So instead, start by talking about wanting to be known authentically and genuinely. And this includes emotional and physical intimacy and sexuality. It all brings the emotional and intimacy together. And really, they could just say, I have a fetish, I need to let you know. And then they could share an article on fetishes before they even share what the particular interest is. And they could also share your podcast.
Yeah.
They could share your podcast to say, here's some information on fetishes. Now, if your listeners are trying to meet somebody, it can be tricky. I get people that come in and say, gosh, I'm trying to meet somebody, and it's almost like a slot machine. And they say, okay, like, we match up politically, we match up like in all these different spaces. I'm attracted to the person, I intellectually stimulating. I've got all these in place, and then we're going to get to the end, and I'm going to have to spring on them. I got this fetish. Like, how in the world am I going to do that, right? And so, we've already kind of talked a little bit about FetLife, but this is very nice because somebody could go on to FetLife and even, they may find a good match for their particular fetish, but they might find somebody with a totally different fetish interest, but somebody's maybe willing to take turns and swap out and kind of go back and forth and meet the person where they are. I also think FetLife is good because you can see how others nationally, like all over, are navigating their particular interest. So there's some benefit to that.
Well, and you're certainly going to feel way less alone, right? Like, look at all of these people,
That's right.
all of these interests. It's like, I think people have this idea that everyone else is just totally vanilla and nothing else is happening in anyone else's bedroom. No,
that's right.
Yeah, there's huge variety.
Yeah. And the last thing I guess I wanted to bring up is that I want to clarify, I do coordinate care with psychiatrists because, and we kind of already said this, but, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or obsessive anxiety, delusions, Asperger's, all these can make it a little bit harder for people because I think they're a little more vulnerable to getting focused, obsessed, and stuck on a particular thing, one particular thing. And I know you always like websites, so I'm going to want to mention, one of the great websites is the National National Coalition for Sexual Freedom. They're advocates for people that engage in alternative sexual expressions, whether it's fetishes or even open relationships. So that's a key one to know, FetLife. And what I'm going to do is actually send you, I have some other ones on, like, at least I think of furries, which is a whole other thing. But anyway, I'm going to send you some of this for your site so they can take a look there.
Perfect. I will put all of those, the list of fetishes you were talking about, all these links, everything can be in the show notes so that they can be available for people.
Yeah, and as I'm thinking about it, I could just list the ways we assess also. So that they can,
perfect.
I know we go through this so fast. We go through it quickly. Summing it all up in quick. But I have to tell you, you are just doing fabulous stuff by getting good information out there to people, because this is one that nobody's going to comment on under your notes. But it's really good information for people that are really too anxious, or, it just brings up so much anxiety and shame that they don't have the information. Another book that's good is called Perv, The Sexual Deviant in All of Us. It's by Jesse Buring, and I'll give you that name too. I thought that was a good book. Yeah.
Great. And finally, where can people learn more about you, get in touch with you if they want to? I mean, you brought a lot of wonderful information here today, and people may have questions or may want to see you in your practice in Memphis or.
Yeah, they can get to me by jennifervalli.com, and then I'm on Twitter with that same name, and then I think it's Sexual Health by Psychotherapist Jennifer Valli on Facebook. But I think really the AASECT, American Association of Sexual Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, is probably way more important than my site, because anybody, no matter where they are, no matter where they're located, can get on that site and hit locate a professional. And you know that you've got somebody that has had a boatload of training and experience. They have to be a general therapist way before they go on to get this extra specialty training. And so I really think that I feel grateful. I have to say, just if I am allowed to tell 3 people thank you, in addition to you, Cynthia Osborne, Dennis Segru, and William Granzig also have just been good. You can't say enough about getting quality training from people that kind of know what they're doing. And for you, who have the training also, and who are interviewing people and asking questions so that everybody can have the information. It's really awesome.
That's what I'm trying. So, thank you so much for being with me today.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.